Welcome to our conversation on center-state financial relations in India. Federalism has been disputed around the globe ever since the outburst of the current COVID-19 pandemic. The power-sharing setups in various countries have had different impacts on the nation's response to the pandemic. India, with its highly dynamic federalism, is no exception. The responsibilities of the central government in Delhi and of states were contested in curbing the pandemic, closing borders, limiting transportation, administering health support, or more recently, distributing or acquiring vaccines. One major aspect of federal relations in India is the fiscal federalism. For instance, the levy of taxes and their redistribution between center, states, and municipalities. Or let's take the centrally sponsored schemes where subnational entities implement and distribute earmarked national programs and government funds within their areas. The federal budget for the current fiscal year, recently presented by the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, might change this setup. Today, I would like to know what the federal budget and the recommendations by the 15th Finance Commission mean for India's fiscal federalism, and what that means for India's center-state relations. It is a privilege to be in conversation today with Professor Chanchal Kumar Sharma. He is a professor of political science at the Central University of Haryana and associate at the GIGA, the German Institute of Global and Area Studies. He publishes widely on the topic of federal systems, especially on political and economic issues. Professor Sharma, thank you for joining our conversation today.
Thank you, Volker. Thanks for getting on this online conversation with me. Thank you so much.
So these contentious issues that I had mentioned just now in the center-state relations are emerging so rapidly, one after another, that it is easy to lose track. From the management of the corona pandemic and the migrant labor crisis to the resolution of disputes related to GST compensation, we always noticed a lack of coordination between the center and the states, and even among the states. Now, new potential flashpoints open up with the 15th Finance Commission recommendations. For instance, the misuse of centrally sponsored schemes as a political tool, or the alleged attempt by the Modi government to expand its fiscal space at the cost of the states, or also the imposition of conditionalities for release of grants to the states, or of course the fiscal consolidation at the central and the state levels. But Professor Sharma, before we go too deep into those details of these quite delicate matters, can you shed some light from your point of view and your experience on the nature of the federal system in India and the unique fiscal setup?
Volker, you have very nicely summarized the core issues. And indeed, it's a great idea to start with the nature of Indian federalism first. In fact, Indian federalism is a flexible model, the precise organization and functioning of which, as stated by B.R. Ambedkar, may be decided by voters through the requirements of time and circumstances. In other words, Indian federalism has been designed to allow centralizing or decentralizing dynamics in the management of public policy to vary widely across time and space. The consequence of this flexibility is clearly visible in the actual functioning of India's federal system since independence. For instance, India functioned as a centralized federation under one dominant party system and as a more decentralized multi-party federal system during the coalition era in Indian politics. Since 2014, there has been a tendency toward greater centralization under the BJP dominant system. Still, even in the times of the BJP's dominance, I would say, in the realm of fiscal federalism, the Finance Commission has proved itself to be the saving grace of Indian federalism. There is no better illustration of this than the way in which the 15th Finance Commission has managed to work around some of the most controversial terms of reference prepared by the Union government ever. For instance, for the first time, a newly constituted commission had been asked to reconsider the recommendations of a previous commission. Clearly, the nudge was to explore the possibility of reducing the state's share in the center's divisible pool of taxes. At the same time, the terms of reference had required the Finance Commission to examine whether post-devolution revenue deficit grants to states were required at all. Furthermore, the Commission was asked on the one hand to recommend measures to incentivize the implementation of central flagship schemes and at the same time to disincentivize the continuation of state schemes by classifying them wherever possible as populist. Overall, the attempt had been to nudge the finance panel to make recommendations in a way that would expand the centre's fiscal space, thereby enabling it to use discretionary powers in various ways and make states dependent on the center more than ever before. Indeed, terms of reference were not legally binding, but at the same time, there was nothing which could have stopped the panel from considering those terms of reference, except for the panel's own judgment and due regard for the spirit of federalism and the Constitution. Against this backdrop, the Finance Commission, I think, has indeed performed a balancing act in an unbiased manner and has proceeded to safeguard not only the foundations of fiscal federalism in India, but also, I believe, its own credibility as a non-partisan, fair, and unbiased institution in which the subnational levels can repose their trust and all their hopes.
If the Finance Commission is so important as you say, as you just laid out, then it's probably not a surprise that the mainstream criticism of the union government's approach at the moment to the central-state financial relations is the acceptance of the 14th Finance Commission recommendations. In fact, if I remember correctly, they have criticized that the government has more or less neutralized the benefit of it was 10% increase in state share in the centre's tax revenue by making cuts in both planned grants and the centre's share of spending on centrally sponsored schemes during the Commission's award period, which was from 2015 to 2020. Is that right?
Yes, Volker, this is partly right. But before answering in affirmative or negative, we need to understand that the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission signified not only a quantum jump in the magnitude of untied transfers to states, but more importantly, it is a compositional shift in transfers from grants to tax devolution. Additionally, it is also to be appreciated that one single reason for such a huge jump in the percentage of devolution was that the 14th Finance Panel, unlike the earlier commission, did not restrict itself to the state's non-plan expenditure requirements only, but proceeded to consider the state's entire revenue expenditure, including state's plan expenditure as well as their contribution toward centrally sponsored schemes. The only natural outcome of the commission's recommendations would have been to discard the normal central assistance for state plans and to require the states to fund their own plans out of the Finance Commission's award. That is what the center has actually done. So I think a discontinuation of normal central assistance, which is also called Gadgil formula grants, is something that was implied in the Finance Commission's award itself. As far as the centrally sponsored schemes are concerned, there is no doubt that the central government has proceeded to safeguard or even expand its fiscal space by reducing its share in the centrally sponsored schemes, thereby forcing the states to contribute even more than what the 14th Finance Panel had factored into while making its recommendations.
I'm not sure if you're suggesting that the center should now completely discontinue the centrally sponsored schemes, or if they are in fact following the recommendations and just shifting their share, or was it shifting the responsibility and the responsibility of implementing and also having a larger say in creating these sponsored schemes to the states? I'm not sure if I express myself correctly.
Yes, you're right, Volker. In the sense that the center should be moving in that direction, but at present the center is not doing all that. In fact, the 14th Finance Commission had identified over 30 centrally sponsored schemes to be delinked from center support. But the central government delinked only 8 in 2015-16 budget, citing national priorities and legal obligations. Initially, after the acceptance of the 14th Finance Panel recommendations, the outlay for schemes appeared to be coming down. For instance, it declined from 6.7% of total transfers in 2015-16 to 5% in 2016-17. However, the RBI data shows that in the subsequent years, the outlay increased substantially and reached around 25% of total transfers in 2019-20. This clearly implies that centrally sponsored schemes have continued to proliferate throughout the 14th Finance Commission award period. However, the key concern, in addition to the fact that these schemes are very regressive, is that they limit the ability of states to legislate on subjects within their competence, within their legislative competence.
If that is the case, then obviously the puzzle is, why would the central government increase the outlays on centrally sponsored schemes when its own constitutionally mandated spending responsibilities such as defense and national security are grappling with any inadequate funding? After all, the central government can easily dispense with these schemes because they intend to fund activities lying in the realm of the state governments.
You're right, Volker. This is in fact a very interesting question, precisely because centrally sponsored schemes impinge upon the spending autonomy of states. However, it is important to note that the national ruling party seeks to use these schemes to create goodwill for its party in states and improve its electoral prospects. That is why the nomenclature of these schemes is often cleverly designed to convey the real benefactor, none other than the Prime Minister himself in most of the cases. Therefore, I would say that most of the governments have not tried to eliminate these schemes because of the potential political uses of these schemes. So, however, the present government has not only continued this practice, but has taken it to a new height by obliging the states to finance a larger part of these schemes, while focusing on claiming full credit for running them. Quite significantly, the 15th Finance Commission has recommended that the number of centrally sponsored schemes as well as outlays on them be reduced. In response, the Union Finance Minister in her budget speech has made a commitment that a detailed exercise will be undertaken to reduce the list of 131 odd centrally sponsored schemes to around 90 before March 2022. It remains to be seen how this will be done. Interestingly, while the finance minister has affirmed the government's resolve to reduce centrally sponsored schemes, the budget 2021 has substantially increased the number as well as the outlay to these centrally sponsored schemes. For instance, 5 new centrally sponsored schemes and 19 new central sector schemes have been added in the budget for the financial year 2021-22. So I don't know how they will bring it down.
Yeah, this is also not a new allegation that there is a certain idea of misuse for political gains of these centrally sponsored schemes. So I guess we're going to see them around for a while. Now, since you just brought up Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, I wanted to come back to the corona pandemic. And another thing that she had announced in the recent budget was an additional centrally sponsored scheme in the health sector. So in addition to the already existing National Health Mission, there was one program, one scheme that sounded very interesting, which I would like to know from you now. Do you think that this will have a positive impact on the development of the health sector in India?
Yes, the finance minister has announced one centrally sponsored scheme in the health sector, which is called Pradhan Mantri Atmanirbhar Swasth Bharat Yojana, roughly translated as Self-Reliant Healthy India Scheme. It has been launched as a centrally sponsored scheme, which means it will be co-funded by the center and the states. Although central schemes are fully funded by the center, are called central sector schemes. So these are 2 types of schemes: centrally sponsored scheme and central sector schemes. These central sector schemes are fully funded by the center. So these type of schemes can play an important role in fulfilling the national priorities. However, as far as these centrally sponsored schemes are concerned, which have rigid one-size-fits-all design and put pressure on states to contribute to those schemes, I think these are always a bad idea. This is especially true when it comes to sectors like health, where there can be region-specific needs and where a lack of flexibility can have vast negative consequences. During the pandemic, we have seen how the stringent guidelines and conditionalities attached to centrally sponsored schemes, including the flagship scheme like the National Health Mission, proved counterproductive. One problematic feature of these centrally sponsored schemes is that central government does not release its share unless states have spent their own share and followed the conditions exactly as stipulated in the design of the scheme. The central departments check whether the detailed guidelines were followed or not before releasing the funds. This reduces states' autonomy and leaves no scope for innovation or even slight modification of schemes to suit their local needs. And I would like to quote the Planning Commission in this, which stated that the centrally sponsored schemes have been plagued by poor implementation, duplication, lack of convergence, and suboptimal outcomes. However, if the government considers centrally sponsored schemes in the area of health as indispensable, then as the 15th Finance Commission has suggested, they should be flexible enough to allow states to adapt and innovate. Otherwise, the best way is to provide unconditional grants or health sector specific grants and let the states design their individual health promotion programs that suit their community requirements.
It is quite the criticism on that scheme. Is it, do I see it correctly, that this would be, again, in violation with the recommendation of the 15th Finance Commission? Or let me ask the other way around, because the suggestion you just made at the end, where you had argued for the states having a high responsibility in the drafting of the sector-specific schemes, would that be in line with the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission?
In fact, in the budget for the current financial year, the government has so far not considered the Finance Commission's recommendations on sector-specific grants to support health, education, agriculture, maintenance of roads, etc. Although this is an unprecedented move, yet the chairman of the Finance Commission, 15th Finance Commission, has said in a recent interview that the government's stand is reasonable in view of the fiscal pressures that the central government is facing. Here it is also important to mention that while the central government has not accepted the Finance Commission recommendations for sector-specific grants and state-specific grants, it has accepted recommendations for revenue deficit grants and grants for local governments and grants for disaster management. Anyway, it is clear that the health sector grant aggregating to around 317 billion to state has not been accepted. Similarly, state-specific grants for health amounting to around 48 billion have also not been accepted. Perhaps the idea is to use the available funds to finance the centrally sponsored scheme in the health center. So, however, the 15th Finance Commission has also provided for yet another component of grants for health sector, aggregating to around 700 billion, which is tagged to local government grants. So at least the local governments will get some grants for improving health infrastructure and health outcomes.
This is a very good point. And let's discuss this a little, because quite often in newspapers, in the media, you listen, you hear, you read always about how much money has been allocated. Now, I wonder as a citizen how much of this money actually reaches. So my question now would be on the funds that have been released or are going to be released. It all sounds very impressive. And you just also ended on a quite positive note here. But these grants, they do have conditionalities attached to them, I hope. And wouldn't these conditionalities, again, limit in a certain way the subnational entities in implementing these schemes or utilizing these funds? What is your take on this issue?
We see that Finance Commission is being asked to impose certain conditionalities in order to motivate states to follow a particular line of action that the central government requires them to follow. I think the confusion arises because people start assessing the merit of specific conditions and then wonder if there is anything wrong with the Finance Commission imposing them. The question here is not whether the conditionalities are good or bad. Indeed, all of them are ostensibly good as they are focused on important reforms which must be carried out. The question is also not whether conditionalities work or not. Sometimes they don't, especially when they impose rigid targets to be met. But sometimes they do, especially when they require states to implement certain reforms, broadly speaking. The questions here are much broader than this. First of all, on the constitutional grounds, the question is whether the Commission is constitutionally empowered to recommend conditionalities, or for that matter, whether the terms of reference have the constitutional mandate to ask the Commission to suggest conditionalities that may be attached to the release of grants to states. On the operational grounds, the question is why local governments should be penalized for the acts of omission on the part of the state governments. Third, and relatedly, there is a political angle, which is that if, for instance, the local governments are controlled by a party which is in opposition to the chief minister's party, the state government may ignore difficult reforms and let the local bodies be starved of funds just to score a political point. Finally, on ethical grounds, there is a risk that imposing conditions on grants to states would become a norm. Once this happens, the probability and the potential of the central government's penetration in the state's domain in the name of conditionalities increases. This, coupled with the center's tendency to expand its own fiscal space by relying on non-shareable levies, that is cesses and surcharges, threatens to demolish the constitutional architecture of Indian fiscal federalism.
I do have a question on these cesses and surcharges as well, but let me just ask one more follow-up question. Would it also be politically instrumentalized to allocate large number of funds, of which then the government, and in this case, let's say the central government, already knows that the states or even the lower subnational entities are not in the position to fulfill the targets and will not be in the position to spend the funds adequately, so that it just it sounds better, but in the end, not all of the funds that agreeably sound quite impressive will be dispersed.
Yeah, it happens because most of the states do not have the capacity to implement all the centrally sponsored schemes. And that is why I said in response to your previous question that centrally sponsored schemes are generally very, very regressive. Regressive in the sense that only those states which are rich, the states which can contribute their share toward those centrally sponsored schemes are better placed to utilize the money that the center has allocated for those schemes.
Okay, now let's get back to the cesses and surcharges, because they're also, the Union Finance Minister has recently announced an additional cess, namely the Agriculture, Infrastructure and Development cess, in her budget to the current running fiscal year. Now, this cess is supposed to be utilized for building infrastructure, for agriculture, but what we have heard from the opposition rule states, they have strongly criticized this move. But what was the issue here?
Volker, the issue here is simply that the proceeds collected from cesses and also from surcharges are not shared with states. It has been noticed that the Modi government has sought to meet its expenditure requirements, not by increasing the rates of shareable taxes, but by imposing non-shareable levies, that is cesses and surcharges. That is why the state governments in their interactions with the 15th Finance Commission had called for inclusion of cesses and surcharges in divisible tax pool, although that has not been done because, as the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, N.K. Singh, said during an interview, that it requires a constitutional amendment and is not in the hands of the commission. However, the commission in its report did take note of the fact that the incidence of these levies has gone up quite significantly since 2015. which has adversely affected states' share in the divisible pool. And as I said, the union government has not only attempted to muster revenue through these non-shareable levies, but has also reduced the rates of shareable taxes. For instance, in 2015-16 budget, the wealth tax was abolished. And in 2016-17 budget, the tax rate on incomes between 2.5 and 5 lakh, that is roughly around 0.25 to rupees 0.5 million, was reduced. However, the surcharges on taxable income were increased by an equivalent amount. Similarly, in the 2018-19 budget, while the excise duty on petrol was reduced by rupees 9 per liter, the road cess was hiked by a comparable amount. So the 15th Finance Commission has not only criticized the use of such a strategy, but has also sought to partly compensate states by recommending a higher grant in aid to states in comparison to previous Finance Commission's award. However, this approach did not suit the central government, and therefore, as you have pointed out, Volker, it has declined to accept the Finance Commission's recommendations on state-specific and sector-specific grants. In addition, the center has found new ways to mobilize revenues for itself via levies which are outside the divisible pool. So this is one of the most important and one of the most contentious issues in the current center-state financial relations.
Mr. Sharma, I fully understand your point there, and it's also clear that the central government has, in large parts, not yet followed the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission. But still, Prime Minister Modi used to be chief minister, and he himself was very dependent on an equal share of funds between center and state when he was in Gujarat. So one could say he knows what he's doing because he's dealing with a number of chief ministers who are in the same position as he used to be. And the central government has also been lauded, for example, from some places for the simplification of the GST reform, the new system of revenue there. So taking all these points together, and from your point of view as a kind of summary of fiscal federalism in India, what do you think is the current union government approach to fiscal federalism, and where will it go from here? What could be the implications?
First of all, Volker, as you have pointed out, that our incumbent Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, was also Chief Minister of Gujarat, and therefore he might fully understand what he's doing. From an observer point of view, it sounds like when a chief minister will become prime minister, he'll take care of the state-related issues. But with the change of position, I think perspective has also changed. In fact, fiscal federalism, it is well known in theory that there are two perspectives on fiscal federalism. One is the subnational perspective, and other is this national perspective. When Narendra Modi was chief minister of Gujarat, he was always projecting subnational perspective on fiscal federalism. And now as a prime minister, what he is doing is actually the national perspective on fiscal federalism. So with the change of position, the perspective has also changed. Overall, I would say that the Modi government's approach to fiscal federalism is all about increasing centralization and increasing states' dependency, even in these difficult times. More generally, the central government has always tried to do three things when it comes to center-state financial relations. Number one, undertake expenditures in the areas which lie in the legislative domain of the states. Number two, nudge the Finance Commission to impose conditionalities on state governments in the name of bringing about macroeconomic stability and fiscal consolidation. And number three, expand its own fiscal space at the cost of states, most controversially by increasing levies such as cesses and surcharges, which obviously the center does not have to share with the states. All this might be in the ruling party's political interest, but in the long run, it is going to hurt the national economic interest in several ways. One important consequence of financial constraints at the state's level is that states are trying to raise revenue and decrease expenditure in the most inefficient manner possible. For instance, first of all, states have hiked stamp duties on immovable property transfers to exceptionally high level, which will adversely affect the real estate sector that has already been decimated over the last few years. This will have a cascading effect on hundreds of allied and core industries, which in turn would actually frustrate the central government's plan to revive the economy via much needed demand boost. Second, some states have increased tax rate on natural gas because it lies outside the purview of the central GST. This will make domestic natural gas economically less viable and hence less competitive in the energy market, which in turn would upset the central government's target to raise gas share in energy mix from 6% to 15% by 2030. Finally, and most significantly, states are curtailing spending on development activities, which is counterproductive because it diminishes demand and slows down the engine of growth.
Your points are very understandable, quite valid. But if there is a tendency for centralization, it seems it's perfectly democratically legitimized. Because we have seen also quite now, and in the very recent 4 state elections, Assam, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and what was the 4th? Pondicherry was union territory.
Pondicherry?
Yeah. I'm sure we're forgetting one right now, but what we could see, West Bengal, of course. West Bengal was one of the most significant improvements for the BJP. So it seems like decentralization is exactly what the voters in India want. So these, I mean, we have seen, of course, these were elections with a very heavy focus on regional parties, and the regional parties were also the ones emerging victorious. So one could say, or I would ask you now, is this a sign of a vibrant and strong federalism, or whether the success is treacherous? And there I would like to go back to my observation that in all these assembly elections, BJP managed to at least hold a certain level of seats, or even significantly gained. So, what were your observations on this?
Indeed, Volker, the outcomes of recent assembly elections have been very interesting. In all 4 states and 1 union territory, which is half state because it has legislative assembly, and that's why elections were held over there. So, but the results were particularly interesting in the case of West Bengal, where Mamata Banerjee has staged a comeback as a chief minister for the 3rd consecutive term. Having said this, the broader lesson that we can draw from these elections is that regional parties are very much in the game. And if they deliver regional development and raise living standards and focus on local issues that matter most at the regional level, then they can deliver a blow to the electoral juggernaut of the BJP. This is clear from West Bengal and Kerala, where regional parties have returned to power. The second lesson that we can draw from the result, from these assembly election results, is that Indian voters adopt the yardstick of competence in both national as well as in state elections. So they tend to vote for nationally competent parties in national elections and regionally competent parties in regional elections. This logic, if you look closely, explains all the results. Trinamool won because of its focus on development and welfare schemes. Similarly, in Kerala, voters rewarded the ruling party for its sincere efforts to protect life and livelihood during the first phase of the pandemic. Although communal polarization played a role in Assam, yet various surveys have shown that the people in Assam were generally happy with the incumbent BJP's performance at the state level. Overall, at the regional level or at the state level, the parties that perform and deliver better outcomes tend to win. Whether it is a national party or a state-based party, a regional party or a regionalist party, whatever. So this is the second lesson. The third lesson, I would say, is that if the BJP is to be countered at the national level, a strong alternative all Indian narrative needs to be articulated. At the state level, wherever we have seen that wherever an alternative narrative exists to counter the BJP's ideology, the BJP has been defeated. Mamata Banerjee in West Bengal has demonstrated that in this election, and previously Arvind Kejriwal in Delhi also demonstrated the same. However, in order to contest national elections, a pan-Indian party organization is required. Fortunately or unfortunately, only Congress has an organizational presence in all the states. But the problem here is that the party has so far failed to reinvent or re-engineer itself. Overall, my view is that if the BJP manages to replicate its victory at the center, while more regional parties manage to retain or regain their foothold at the state level, very soon we will see a new model of federal democracy emerging in India.
These are very interesting observations, and I think we can constitute at this point that we have to also probably have to speak about this in a different time frame, because I can already see that there's so many different topics emerging from this. I think at this point we can conclude that both federalism and fiscal federalism in India remain dynamic, remain vibrant and very much alive, but also a challenge to the political setup. And we continue to observe this together with you, Professor Sharma. I thank you so much for being here with us today and for your very interesting observations.
Thank you, Volker. Thanks a lot.
Please take care and stay safe. Hopefully we will also be able to have such an event as today in person again.
Yeah. Thank you, Volker.
Thank you so much.